Hey y'all, I'm Dan Hamilton, host of the Next Gen Warrior Show. As always, the Next Gen Warrior Show is brought to you by Chairman George P. Bush and the Texas Veterans Land Board. Today I have a really great guest, Judd Kauffman, Navy SEAL veteran, co-founder and president of Terradepth. Judd, thank you for being with us today as we are recording once again from the home studio. So tell us about your military service, your background, and then how you became president at Terradepth.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on. I'm proud and humbled to be here. So appreciate what you guys are doing with this program. Background, Terradepth. It's a long story. I'm going to give you the short version, and then you can ask questions if anything is interesting.
Let's do that.
Short version is when I was in the Navy, so 2002 until 2010, there was a submarine, the USS San Francisco, that unfortunately ran into a seamount, underwater mountain. And I remember hearing the news in one of the morning intel briefings and thinking, how does that happen? This is one of our most expensive, most secretive, most prized assets, and it ran into a mountain. And the reason it ran into the mountain is because it didn't know that the mountain was there. So that information sort of planted the seed in my head that first of all, I was shocked that we didn't have the ocean mapped effectively. I think like most people, most Americans, I thought, yeah, we've got a good understanding of what's down there underwater, especially the U.S. Navy. The reality is it couldn't be farther from the truth. We, in fact, know more about our solar system and other planets than we do our own planet, and that's because most of it is under the ocean. So fast forward, I got out of the Navy, got into business for a while, did a few different things, and saw what was happening with autonomous systems and robotics. Companies like Tesla, saw all the space exploration happening, and thought, why doesn't someone apply this disruptive technology to the undersea exploration world? And a buddy of mine from the Navy, Joe Wolfel, my co-founder at Terradepth, he and I started to talk about the idea. We took it to an investor group. They said, this is great. We took it to some friends at MIT who had done some work on some Navy submersibles. And we said, hey, we're just a couple knuckle draggers, but is this idea any good? And they said, yeah, we like this idea and we think it could work. So we raised some money and hired a very intelligent team, and we're off to the races on building our first prototype autonomous deep ocean robot.
So for the audience's understanding, why has it been so difficult to map the ocean and study the ocean versus looking out at the stars?
The main reason is signal attenuation. So you think about a radio signal, it can travel pretty far through space. You try to send that same signal through the deep ocean, and it dies pretty quickly. And so, we've got submarines that can go to the deepest parts of the ocean, and they can collect whatever data we want. But we can't produce those on scale because it's impossible, at least it has been, due to technological limitations, to build autonomous systems that can do that. So only in the last probably 5 years has the technology, i.e. machine learning, artificial intelligence, et cetera, come online to the point where it's even feasible to put a massive fleet of autonomous deep sea submersibles out there and have them accurately map the ocean.
So how long have you been, not just how long have you been president of Terradepth, but how long have you been at this problem with the team around you? And I know the concept for it may have been planted a long time ago, but how early are you in the process?
2017 is when we started doing analysis of the market. So we knew the technology theoretically was there, and we knew that problem could be solved with some smart brains. But what we didn't know is if there was a market. The military obviously cares what's down there. So there's one customer, but probably not enough to sustain this kind of a business. So we looked at other markets that are out there, and that was in 2017. Once we validated the market, which took about 6 months, we were into 2018. We took that research to the investors and said, hey, here's what we found. We think this is a legitimate opportunity.
So I'm
And then,
interested too. Sorry,
oh,
keep going.
yeah. So just to close that out, June of 2018 is when the company launched, and then
Okay.
we hired our first team that fall.
So what is it like to be in the middle of a startup that is on the cutting edge of technology, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of stay at home, in the midst of quarantine? How have you as a leader either changed your leadership style, or what have you learned being in a startup in such an unpredictable environment?
Yeah, it's a question that a lot of people are talking about right now. How do you lead in an environment like this? I'm lucky in that I've got a co-founder, and he and I, we worked together in the Navy in 2004 and beyond, and so we co-lead and co-manage the
Really?
company. So it's nice. It's nice to have somebody to bounce ideas off of. It's nice to have somebody to pull into a corner. We have the same interests, so we're well aligned there. But our leadership philosophy really hasn't changed. It was something that we learned in the SEAL teams, and unfortunately, it's too rare that you see. I think what we would call as military veterans, great leadership
Yeah.
outside of a few companies, and then some great military units. But it's a bottoms up approach, one of enabling others to come together and accomplish something that you yourself as a leader could never accomplish. We view leadership as a skill set, just as our electrical engineer has his engineering skill set. Leadership is a skill set, and there are some discrete things that you can leverage as a leader, just like an engineer can leverage discrete tools that he's learned throughout his career in education to get his job done. So that's how we look at it. And in terms of how the pandemic has changed things, from at kind of a personal local level, we've given all the guys the option of working from home if they're not comfortable coming in. And so most guys are working from home, but there are some pieces of hardware in the office that guys need to come in and work on. So they're doing that. Thankfully, it's not a crowded space, especially now. So we're lucky too that we raised our funds in 2019 enough to carry us through this year. I've got a lot of friends who are founders or co-founders, and they're in a different position,
Sure.
trying to raise money right now, and it's a difficult time.
To veterans out there, or maybe folks who haven't served but are in the startup community, are looking to launch a business and have been maybe trying to do so for the past 6 months, what's your message to them?
I can't predict the future, but I've spent the last few weeks trying to do my share of research and a little bit of analysis. Looking at some past crises and seeing how the venture capital environment and the startup community responded. And my take, this is my opinion. I'm certainly no expert.
No, that's great. That's what I love to hear.
Yeah, my take is that in the next 60 days, we're going to start to level out on some new normal, and people will get back to work. There are a lot of smart business minds I've been reading, and this is controversial, but there's one position that, hey, let's keep doing what we're doing right now and contain and protect everyone. There's another position that says at a certain point, and maybe we've already crossed it, the damage that we're doing with these protective measures, in fact, outweigh the protection that we're putting in place.
Correct.
So I think the scales will tip. A third of the economy is offline, and I read a stat the other day that had analyzed suicide rates post 2007, 2008 financial crisis,
Right.
and it was close to 1 million suicides. You've got domestic abuse up right now, depression is up, anxiety is up. So I think we're going to start to transition to a system where folks who are at high risk need to stay home and self-quarantine and take advantage of what the government and what business leaders are offering in terms of benefits for those folks. But sure, those who don't have underlying health issues or who have already been exposed to the virus and have passed through it will be getting back to work sooner than later. I've been talking to our investors who come from the venture world, asking for their perspective, and they're planning for the worst, but they're starting to see a little bit more optimism, and are hopeful that by the end of this year, we'll be through this thing.
Yeah, and for somebody who is just working on starting a business or it has a startup, you would think that maybe coming on the other side of this, that maybe what they can focus on is, hey, this might actually accelerate things down the road when we do get back to some sort of normalcy, that people will want to again put money back to work into companies, that people will be hiring, and it's really just a matter of time before they do that. And the message almost right is that you have to keep going and try to see kind of the light at the end of the tunnel a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's right. These unfortunate crises, they often do sort of speed things up on the tail end, and they bring the future to us sooner than they would have otherwise. There's always a silver lining, and I think people can choose to have a negative perspective and look at all the negative that's coming with this crisis. There's certainly no shortage of negative here. Mm-hmm. Or you could choose to focus on what the positive side is. They're both there, so it's your choice which direction you choose to spend your mind space.
Yeah, and so I want to talk a little bit about the current pandemic, but in the sense that you just recently wrote an article that I found on Medium, and it talks about the importance of the ocean, the minerals that are there, the resources that can be found there, and even ways that it can help the health and welfare of the people either suffering from this or help in many different ways across the health industry. Can you talk about the importance of understanding what's actually in the ocean, to not just here in the United States, but the benefits of it for people across the world?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. It's really mind-boggling, Dan, some of these stats and facts about our ocean that I never knew. Even after 10 years in the Navy, I didn't understand just how little we knew about the ocean. So here's a couple of examples. This is the long answer to your question, but it's so fascinating and so mind-blowing that I think we should spend at least a little bit of time, because I think that it's important that people start to pay more attention to it. Ray Dalio, who's a famous, very well-respected Wall Street hedge fund manager and investor, he wrote an article some time ago complaining about the lack of investment going into ocean exploration. And in his article, he said, we're spending 160 times our budget for space exploration is 160 times greater than our budget for ocean exploration. And the return on investment in the space is just not quite there. The ROI in the ocean is there. So it's you start learning more about the ocean, as I have done in the last 3 years. And a few things that kind of struck me. One is that the livable space on Earth, which is also called our biosphere, is almost completely underwater. So 99.97% of all livable space on our planet is in the ocean. And so you don't think about that, because you hear the statistic that 3/4 of the Earth is covered in ocean. Well, that's the surface. When you consider the third dimension there, and you consider depth, it's almost 100% of the Earth is made of seawater. So with respect to and other medications, which is obviously front of mind right now in the pandemic, about 65% of all pharmaceuticals on the market today are either derived from or synthesized from some natural resource. And given that the vast majority of natural resources on Earth live in the ocean, and given that the ocean is still about 60 to 70% unexplored, it stands to reason that once we have effectively explored the ocean and mapped it and built the data set, that the vast majority of all medication and antibiotics will come from some creature, some organism undersea.
Can I pause you real quick on that?
Yeah.
So for our audience, they hear you use the word map, but you're doing more than that, right? Can you explain what you mean by mapping the ocean?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. There's not a better term that we've found than map to describe what we're talking about doing. But it's effectively a multi-dimensional data set to include a map of the seafloor. So the topography underwater is called bathymetry. So our submarines will be able to complete a highly detailed, when I say detailed, I mean sub 1 meter imagery. Your military veterans will know what that means.
Yeah.
And right now, people say we've got a map of the entire ocean, and that's true, but it's of such low resolution that if the entire island of Manhattan were underwater, we probably wouldn't know that it was there, right?
Huh.
We're looking at like a 50-kilometer level of resolution. So back to our map. So it's not only the bathymetric map of the seafloor topography, but it's also water column data. So in other words, what is the temperature, the salinity level, what are some other chemical properties of this particular area of water? What organisms have we detected there? And then I think more importantly, how does that compare with 1 year ago or 5 years ago in the same area? There's climate change is definitely a real thing, but I think a lot of people believe that we know why and we know how, and the reality is that we don't. And it's because we have no idea what's happening on our planet, and that's because we can't access most of it. It's too damn expensive.
Right.
And that's the problem Terradepth is trying to solve for. It's really how do we take the cost out of ocean exploration. And
so you may hear Annie outside in the backyard barking. She's our neighborhood dog. So if you're picking up some of that audio, that's what happens when you're recording from the home studio. But I'm interested to know what success looks like for you at Terradepth in a short-term and a long-term perspective.
Yeah. So if I put on my most optimistic hat, which I tend to try to do as a founder, right? I want to make this vision become reality. And that vision is the entire Earth has been mapped. We know exactly what's down there. We've identified the vast majority of species on the planet, which to date, we've identified less than 2% of all species on the planet. That's another crazy stat.
Because of so much of the species being in the ocean.
That's right.
Okay.
And many of them are microscopic, but nonetheless, they're living creatures, and we can learn something from them. So if you picture back to our vision and what we're going to produce, picture Google Earth. And when you first open up the software program, you're looking at the globe, and you can zoom in to your neighborhood, and you can zoom around in your neighborhood, and you can pan and tilt, and you can look at your neighbor's house and check out the pool and all that. And it's a lot of fun. Our vision is to create the same experience for the ocean. So instead of zooming into your neighborhood, you'd zoom into your favorite fishing spot or just some random deep part of the ocean, and you zoom all the way down to the bottom where there's no light, right? So we're not using imagery like Google Earth is using satellite imagery. We're using a digitized three-dimensional world, but you could still interact with the seafloor in the same way that you interact with your neighborhood in Google Earth, and you can zoom around and see things. And you can also learn about chemical properties, temperature, and those other data sets that we talked about. And that's useful primarily for researchers who are looking for new natural resources, whether it's to create medication or learn about climate change or learn about some earth behavior or other scientific uses. There are rare earth minerals, for example, that are in the ocean that could have properties that are beneficial to humans or other species. Think about salvage. So there's about $400 billion worth of sunken treasure that we know about. We just don't know where it is. And it's just too expensive for prospectors that work in, ocean salvage to go drive around randomly looking for sunken ships, for example.
So in your version of success, are you thinking that when these submersibles go out and you want to have a fleet of them, is my understanding, that you initially or theoretically sit in your office and watch it scan the ocean floor? Are you going to be able to get back live imagery? So let's say there's a shipwreck out there and you're like, oh, wow, our submersible is going over a shipwreck, a mile or so beneath the earth. Is this something that you are going to actually watch in real time before the data is published?
It'll be near real time. So our robots will deploy at a minimum in a pair. And so one of them will, and they're identical vehicles. One's at the surface, and one is submerged doing data collection.
Okay.
The submersible that's on the surface is maintaining comms with the satellite for primarily geolocation, and also comms with our headquarters, which will be here in Austin. So if there are any problems it needs to report, it'll let us know, and then we can tell it to do whatever we need to tell it to do. But its buddy, it's down below. The communication between those two is pretty limited. It has to be.
Okay.
Again, back to signals attenuation.
Yeah.
So all they're doing is communicating location, because we need as much precision as possible for that submerged asset. But we're developing a very intelligent robot, and so if it sees something, some anomaly, it will detect that immediately. So let's say a sunken ship, it will know, most likely, if we do a good job of training the machine, it will know that's a sunken ship. And it'll turn on its camera. It'll take optical images of that while it's doing its data collection mission. But then when it surfaces and its buddy takes its place down below, they sort of leapfrog through the water column like that. Yeah. Once it surfaces, it will send us some selective information. There's too much data there to send via SATCOM, which is, again, a cost limitation. If we had all the money in the world, we could just pay those data rates. But we can't afford that. So we're designing the robot so that it can send us little bits of information. So you imagine being on an operation, as a Marine, you guys had call signs or pass phrases that meant something to HQ, and you didn't have to send a whole paragraph of information. It was a 2-word code, and they knew what that meant. We're designing something similar in the robot.
Wow, that's incredible. So I think, you briefly mentioned it, that there's shipwrecks down there. There may be, I think, if I'm correct, hundreds of millions of dollars in either lost treasure or different sort of artifacts at the ocean floor. So do you in some ways consider yourself almost like a treasure hunter? Is this something that you guys are able to find and collect, or is it all owned by someone?
Yeah, it's tough to resist the urge to want to fall into the treasure hunter category, because it's really cool. But at the end of the day, we are the data provider. Sure. So there are salvage companies, prize,
I guess.
Yeah, but there are models for contracts that salvage companies have with other prospectors, and sometimes it's okay, you get a 20% finder's fee or something. But also, these sovereign nations, like there's a lot of Portuguese and Spanish gold, for example, at the bottom of the ocean. Yeah. And if you find that, those governments have a claim to the assets on board. Right. But they also understand that you've incurred costs to find it. So there's a way that the salvage companies can make money from, Spain, for example, if they find a couple of $1 million of Spanish gold.
Yeah. So the last question that I have for you today, and I appreciate you joining us, is we've got a great opportunity here to talk about some really, really unique things. Before we wrap it up, has the information, has the data, has the science, has it come naturally to you, or is this something that you've had to bring some people on to try to help you process all of this information?
It does not come naturally to me. Okay. I walk into the office in the morning and I'm immediately reminded that I'm the dumbest guy in the room. But that's okay. I'm
that's
proud
why you
of that.
hired those other folks, right?
That's right. It's important to know yourself and know your limitations. Yeah. So, I'm a good team builder. Maybe I have a few other skills, but that's one that comes to mind. So I think, bringing the minds together who are really, really good at this stuff has been one of my big contributions to the company. But I know enough about technology to usually keep my mouth shut and leave it to the experts.
Let them do the talking about that, and you get to do the listening, huh?
Yeah.
Well, last thing before we go, I want to ask you if there is a message out there that you'd like to send to veterans, to our audience here. We've talked a lot about science, we've talked about business and a whole lot of different things, but our show here we take a lot of pride in, and I know that Chairman Bush does well about promoting the success stories of veterans, and just a message that you would provide to veterans out there who might be struggling and are looking for just a little bit of encouragement to overcome a struggle that they may face. And again, I appreciate you coming on and telling us about your story and everything that Terradepth is doing.
Yeah, I would be happy to kind of share some thoughts on that, and I could talk all day about it. So feel free to cut me off if I go too long. But I'll talk about my experience, and hopefully people can relate to it and pull something of value out of it. It hasn't been easy. My transition was really hard. I went through deep depression. I struggled to find an identity. It took me a while. I felt like I had made this huge mistake getting out. I felt trapped in a lot of ways. I felt guilty and selfish. I still had friends deploying. I still saw, troops in combat. I still do. Mm-hmm. So, the first thing, my first piece of advice for anyone who's in a similar situation where you're post-service and you're depressed or you're struggling for whatever reason, first thing is find some way to volunteer. Because I realized after, unfortunately, a couple of years post-transition that one of the main reasons that I was depressed was because I had lost this sense of purpose. Yeah. But I didn't know it. When I joined the military, it was because of 9/11, and the reason I joined was for revenge and to go to war. And I had this civic duty void that was immediately totally overfilled with pride and satisfaction that, hey, I'm doing something for good. And then when I got out of the military, that switch was just flipped off, and that vacuum sucked all that out of that void, and it was gone, but I didn't identify it. And I was depressed, and I think that was a big reason. And so when I started to involve myself in the community and help with just small groups, I volunteered at a local private school, talking to kindergartners and reading stories. That's kind of where it started. And then I started giving time to veteran organizations, and I started helping guys get jobs. And I wasn't making money necessarily, but I was feeling better about myself. And then that started the snowball of good things, right? I got back into the gym, which is so critical. I started to care for myself. I started to love myself again. And it's funny, when you hate yourself, you find a lot of solace in a bottle of booze and an unhealthy diet, and then you stop working out. But when you start to respect yourself again, you treat yourself the right way. I was treating my dog better than I was treating myself for a while. And be a learner, right? It's if you're like me and you joined when you were young, you matured in the military, and then you left, and things are new now, and you have to start over in many respects, which is should be looked at as an opportunity. You should constantly be learning new things, trying new things, because no one's going to just walk up to you and give you your orders for the next 2 years, like they did in the military. You've got to create your future here. You can, in a sense, in the military, if you just showed up on time with the right gear and did what you were told, you could have 20 years of a great career where you really never make any major decisions. That is not the case on the outside. So you need to find what makes you tick and fucking go after it. What else here? Advice for transition. There's a lot that you learned in the military, that we learned in the military, that is directly applicable to business. It takes a little bit of time to learn what that is, and that's mostly an exercise in vernacular and vocabulary, right? It's a lot of the same concepts. So I think
a lot of time too, it's cultural, and that's something that I found out on the show. And I don't mean to interrupt you there, but I think part of that vernacular and understanding how to express yourself is learning how to deal in the culture too. And I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it just takes time. It takes time to assimilate. But if you're holed up in the basement or you're sitting in your garage, playing Guitar Hero, you're not learning how to kick ass on the outside. So you've got to get out there, make yourself vulnerable. Don't be afraid to expose yourself, because that's where the growth comes from.
Right. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, Judd. That's a really inspirational message, and it's something that I think not only veterans need to hear, but the thing that I love about the transition advice that you gave is that it can be applied to anybody regardless of their service background. And I appreciate you sharing that today. I appreciate your honesty and being forthright. And those are all lessons that, if applied, can really impact the transition out of the service, and will hopefully help somebody who is in a difficult spot today. And again, I want to thank you for being our guest on Next Gen Warrior here. Keep up the good work. You're a great example of continued service and leadership, and excited to hear more about Terradepth in the future, and hope that you'll come back on the show in the future.
I'd be happy to. Dan, thanks a lot for all you're doing here. Appreciate the time.
Absolutely. On behalf of myself and Chairman George P. Bush of the Texas Veterans Land Board, thank you again for joining us here at the Next Gen Warrior Show. We'll see you next time.
Follow us on Instagram at Voices of Vets, on Twitter at Voice of Veterans, and on Facebook at facebook.com/Voices of Veterans. To hear more, please visit voicesofveterans.org. Join us in sharing the success stories of Texas veterans. Thank you for joining us for the Next Gen Warrior podcast.